I, I perfectly understand. All right. So while we are already seeing many governments and daytime industries adapt for climate change, most of the world's nighttime economies are slow to embrace the climate change ramifications that are already here, not to mention the ones that are looming on the horizon. Maybe you will provide the leadership that we need. Climate change after dark. That is the topic of this 24-hour Nation webinar. 24-Hour Nation is a project that produces a podcast and free webinars. We also curate news and information from around the world for nighttime economy advocates and their allies. Our panel of experts today includes Michele Acuto, Director of the University of Melbourne's Melbourne Centre for Cities, as well as Professor and Vice Dean of Research in the university's Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. Just announced in June, he will step into the position of Pro-Vice Chancellor for Global Engagement at the University of Bristol in the UK, halfway around the world, where he will provide leadership and oversight of that university's international initiatives and global civic engagement objectives, only without all the giant Australian spiders. Andreina Sayas is a Venezuelan researcher and international consultant with more than 15 years of experience in urban development and policy in Latin America, Europe, and the United States. As an author of nighttime studies and a curator of countless international conferences and think tanks, Andreina is an associate with Gale, an urban design and research consultancy. Currently based in Paris, Andreina is Gale's urban activation strategist for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. I can only assume that China was already taken, or else they would have given that to you as well. Alessio Colulius, close, holds a joint PhD. This is fascinating. Art and technology and urban planning. As a lecturer and co-program leader in the urban economic development at the Bartlett Development Planning Unit at the University College London. Alessio's research delves into urban inequalities, especially in relation to nocturnal labor and sustainability. He is the author of countless book chapters and articles on nighttime economies and urban geography. In fact, all three of our panelists are very respected researchers and authors. It's an honor to have you all here, whether my Texas mouth can pronounce your names correctly or not. And I apologize. Thank you, though, for being here. Our audience, just so everyone knows, as best as I can tell, from those who have registered, you have joined us from around the world. You are nighttime economy advisors and managers, urban planners, experts in disciplines related to the urban night, ranging from lighting designers to concert promotion to harm reduction to supply chain management. You are academics, researchers, students, consultants, cultural economy advocates, and you're as intrigued about the impact of climate change on our city's nighttime ecosystems as I am. Thank you for joining us. My name is Randall White. 24-Hour Nation is my project, and I believe in the wonder and potential of our cities at night. Before we begin, a few notes. Toward the end of the hour, you will have the opportunity to submit questions, which I will triage for our panelists. You can also post questions or chat during the webinar. Our panelists or I may respond to them. However, we are not going to debate today whether or not we are experiencing climate change. That's the rule. We are. The webinar will be posted to the 24-Hour Nation website and our YouTube channel within one day. Now, to our guests, my plan, lady and gentlemen, is to basically give you the next 30 minutes. I know you've compared notes. You've talked about what you want to talk about. You are the experts. I am merely the convener. So I turn it over to you. And let's begin with you, Professor Acuto. Sure, why not? I still want to see a giant Australian spider. If you
Why
have
not?
one
Sure.
crawl through your office.
Uh, Shout if you see anything in the background. Shout.
All
I
right.
will promptly leave my corner. But thanks, Randall. We haven't. We actually we did not rehearse who was going first on what. But we're a comedic trio and we can do this. But thanks a lot for putting this together. We're really appreciative, and there's lots of people on the call that are more of an expert than some of us. So we'll do our best. We thought we organized a bit of the kickoff of the conversation around the elements of climate change. So sort of the conversation on adapting to climate change, mitigating climate change, and then the two things that sit together. And seeing the audience, we probably don't need to make a point on why the nighttime is important per se, which is probably a good thing. But I guess to get us going with that, but maybe I'm gonna throw it to then Alessio, because the beginning of the whole story, Alessio is what brought us, Andreina, myself, and him together. So I think it's fair that he get the ball rolling a bit on this. But I guess the main thing for me to start on that is to unpack a bit I guess the advent of climate change after dark. And my provocation to start with is that obviously we live in a world of warming temperatures. Obviously, we often shorten climate change with it's getting hotter or global warming, and it is fair. It is fair to keep an eye on that sort of 1.5 or 2 degrees increase that could change dramatically how we live. But the impact of climate change, and especially the impact of climate change at nighttime, and especially on not just nighttime activities, but nighttime work, living after dark, needs to be entangled a bit more as extremes, extreme weathers, extremes of climate conditions, and so forth. So I guess my initial prompt before I sort of throw it to Alessio for a bit more of a casting of why we're here, what are we doing here, is don't automatically attach climate change after dark, meaning hotter nights. It does in many cases, but it also means more extreme conditions. So sort of my prompt is always imagine yourself being, and some of us might have had that experience, waste worker or a gig economy driver or rider having to do this in the middle of Canada in the winter, or in the middle of flood season in Australia, or in the middle of heavy windstorms in for that matter Texas, or sort of the hotbed of our country here in Australia. So in a sense, I guess what I wanted to get us thinking and square from the beginning is that adapting and mitigating climate change at nighttime doesn't just mean adapting to hotter temperature, and doesn't just mean the extremely well researched reality of hotter temperatures means worse sleep. Yes, it does, but it also means incredibly complex and hard conditions for those that live and work at nighttime through very complicated realities. And so we live through fires and floods and sleet all the time here. But should I throw it to you, Alessio, for slightly more coherent, broader casting of what are we doing here? Then we'll throw it a bit back and forth.
Thank you, Michele. And I mean, it's true that at some point I wanted, to have a chat with Michele and Andreina specifically about nighttime and climate change, but there are probably many participants here that are excellent researchers, and I was inspired by a lot of the people who do excellent research on nighttime, and it was just a matter of joining dots really. And I think for me, it's in the last few years, when, at nighttime events and talking to stakeholders and cultural promoters, as well as people working in the sort of nighttime governments, organizations around the world. I think we talked more and more with COVID, after COVID, about nighttime sustainability. And I think when we talked about sustainability at night, we often talked about how we can preserve a little bit what we have. We know, for example, I think today, the Nighttime Industry Association in the UK published yet another report about the disappearance of clubs and pubs and music venues in the UK. And so for me, I wanted to move beyond that. And I thought, hey, we need, we know about maps that have done a great job at mapping those venues that are at risk or have disappeared. And I think with climate change, we need to start looking at those nighttime venues, cultural venues that also are at risk, yeah, because of climate change. So, like, let me give you some examples of this story. And now I'm doing a bit of a counter argument to what Michele just said, because I still. I mean, I'm half Italian, half Greek. Like the heat waves are sort of like a big topic. They impact tourism, yeah. So and the nightlife there in Southern Europe, it's something that I know and I cherish and I enjoy. But looking back at heat waves and how they're impacting these cultural events and music events. I was particularly struck like like a few months ago, a Taylor Swift fan in Brazil died of heat exhaustion at one of Taylor Swift concerts in Rio de Janeiro. And like that, we can think about other events, probably less dramatic, but equally very severe and extreme, like the Burning Man Festival in the US that last year, hit the headlines because of the floods. And so I think more and more we need to think about how climate change is impacting these music events, concerts, music venues. So it's also when we have this audience, yeah, of cultural operators, night operators. We need to think about seasonality. We need to think a lot more about what to do and where and at what time of the day. Andrina, I'll invite you also to share some of your work that you're doing with some of the cities in Southern Europe.
Yes, thanks, Alessio. Thanks, Michele. Thanks, Randall, for organizing this great conversation. And as Alessio was saying, it's great to see so many familiar names joining this call. It's this field is a growing field for a reason, because it's a growing ecosystem, a growing network of people that care about this topic, and it's fantastic to see them here today, as well as new faces and new names as well. To start, I'm going to share a little bit about the work that I'm currently doing. So I currently work for Gale, and we're an urban strategy firm that focuses on user-generated urbanism. And what does that mean? So we first observe how people are using a space, whether it's a park, a street, a sidewalk, and then we design strategies that respond to this user behavior. When we think about the night, one thing that's important is that we have observed that while public life at night is very different from public life during the day, there are some daytime activities such as picnics, walking your dog, playing chess in a park, or even swimming on the beach that have become more common after dark. And when we think about the idea of a 24-hour city, the first thing that our mind goes to is to light pollution, to noise complaints, to lack of sleep. But increased nighttime activity is not only a cause, but also a consequence of these rising temperatures. And one thing that most people don't realize is that hot nighttime temperatures have been outpacing daytime temperature increases in the past decade. So this is especially true in cities where we have, of course, the urban heat island effect. So more concrete, more asphalt absorbs more of the sun's heat, which makes cities warmer. And one thing that I wanted to share with you is that this idea that the night should not only be the time to get a break from the workday, but also a time for our bodies to get a break from the heat. But these higher temperatures, as Michele said, are not only affecting our sleep, our ability to sleep, but also encouraging us to think about how can we use the night in a more creative and inclusive way. And that's, I think, the prompt that I want to share. I mean, we can discuss about how can we get creative in terms of governance, in terms of regulations. And because life at night is relevant for climate change from the adaptation and from the mitigation perspective, understanding that the experience of the city, whether it is during the day or during the night, is far from monolithic, and that climate change has different impacts over different people. So we have a greater impact over seniors, children, displaced communities. We mentioned workers before, and I think it's very important to think about from the adaptation perspective, and I'll throw this so we can maybe discuss a little bit more about this, which kinds of jobs cannot be performed during heat waves, for instance. And I will bring an example from a place like Spain. So in Spain in 2023, the government enacted a law that bans outdoor jobs during heat waves. So this refers to sweeping, street sweeping, gardening, and other activities that have to be interrupted, have to be reduced, or made more flexible during extreme temperatures. And there are many workers who could benefit from these kinds of measures. Think about delivery workers that have to cycle through cities in the middle of severe rain, snow, or under 40 degrees Celsius in the summer. And a way to manage perhaps these conditions is to lengthen expected delivery times or to raise delivery fees. Or maybe restaurants could just offer these workers a hot beverage or a cold drink while they wait to collect their orders. So we already know, we have the data of where these workers are. We have the data of where they're agglomerating. How can we create better spaces and regulations to make them, to allow them to rest, to stop, to hydrate, to use facilities? And maybe we can somehow contemplate, for instance, non-food deliveries to move them into the night when it's possible. So I'll throw this now, and I know Alessia knows a lot about nighttime workers, but I think it's interesting to think about this from an adaptation perspective.
Alessio?
Yeah, do you want to jump back in, Michele? I mean, no, just maybe to reinforce some of the points that Andreina has made, yeah. So, and some of the sort of research that we've started doing, and hopefully we'll be able to come up with maybe a research publication, yeah. But again, I think some of one of the key points is that we should start perhaps seeing the nighttime activities as both as a cause as an effect of climate change. And I think this is really important, as Andreina said, when we think about the heat island effect in cities and what cities and planners can do about it. So thinking about the adaptation of public spaces to enhance climate resilience. Yeah. So for example, implementing cool zones or also flood resistant areas. Yeah. That can also ensure the continuity, yeah, of nighttime activities, but also safeguarding those who are more vulnerable. Yeah. So for example, there is a whole literature also well researched in the US about heat inequity, yeah, and how certain parts of the cities that are hotter, yeah, at night, so it's a lot more difficult to sleep in those housing units, are also the ones that have been historically racialized. But so on the one hand, we need to think about public space. On the other hand, I think it's more, here for me, it's another message for policymakers or people working in public bodies, is linking some of the, for example, heat wave plans that a lot of states and cities have, linking them with a nighttime lens. So, for example, I don't know if you remember, in 2003, there was a heat wave in northern France that hit also Paris. And there were unprecedentedly high days, but especially nighttime temperatures, yeah, for a period of over 3 weeks. And this resulted, for example, in 15,000 excess deaths, you know? And the vast majority of these were among older people, age 65 and above. And in England, for example, which is where I'm based in London, during the same period, in August 2003, there were over 2,000 excess deaths. So even for cities and countries where you're probably thinking, actually not as impacted as climate change, there were nonetheless excess deaths. So following that heat wave, in the UK, there was the first heatwave plan for England that was published in 2004. I think the work that we need to do now is 20 years later is to update those plans with a nighttime lens and making these different also institutional public bodies speak to each other, because I think the key is collaboration often between these public stakeholders.
Why do you think that that's important? That I mean, we don't currently have that. We have all these governmental silos that are not necessarily talking to each other anyway. And we have still that kind of daytime lens, as you referred to, Alessio. Why is it important to Michele that who's going to do that? Who's going to elevate this to their attention so that they actually do something to talk about this in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I think Alessio is right on that element. One of the things that brought us three together is that one big potential here is that there's a massive economic argument in a sense, right? And the economic argument has worked really well in our personal and some of the people tuned in as well experiences of making the case for looking at the nighttime, right? So the work done in London, the work done that we did in Australia. When you make the economic argument, then the political machinery starts listening. The massive economic shift that the impact of climate change has on work and how it's transforming fundamentally some industries, construction, and the likes of it, really has the potential to then cut across quite a few of the powerful bit of the political machinery. Because one argument is always that lots of us are enamored and really love the core of the nighttime economy, but it's probably the fringes of it that it's going to make and break this kind of conversation on climate change. Again, logistics, construction, sanitation and waste management and so forth. But just to throw you a couple of simple, I think making the economic facts speak is where it gets us. Example, the International Labour Organization says that by 2030, we're going to lose 4% of work hours in the world. That means 130 plus, probably 140 million jobs to disappear because of climate change. And of that, a huge proportion is shifting after dark. If you want to do an American kind of audience story, that's 13 million jobs in the US that are vulnerable to climate change. Quite a substantial size of that shifts into the night, but those are precisely the ones we're not typically planning for. I think we've been very good at bringing some elements of the nighttime economy into the conversation. Our experience in Australia, for instance, is the political machinery is still not ready, still not grasping the implications on the known for nighttime economy that potentially has really sizable impact. Along with the massive economic shift, you have a massive problem of changes of seasonalities. So it is tongue-in-cheek to start with Taylor Swift, but it is a reality that entertainment activities are really shifting, and not just shifting into the night, shifting to certain nights. Our new Melbourne flagship festival, it's a nighttime-based festival. It puts together arts, industry, technology, and music all in one bit. Gets announced around August. Anyone that has been to Melbourne would go August. August is probably worse than autumn in London, in a sense, in Melbourne. So why do you do it in August? And the reality is, well, you can't really do it in January anymore. It's just simply not viable. Certain nights stop being even less viable than others. So I think, to me, it's a question of the cause and effect argument that Alessia and Dorina were saying before. To me, it's a point of making the economic argument because of the size of the economic transformation of the job industry, the workplaces, and the preparation that we have. And then we go back to the classic nighttime economy argument. None of this is in current policy. Very little has been acknowledged. To me, the very simple thing one can do is the publication on climate change and jobs, which is the International Labour Organization working in a warmer planet, is 98 pages, extremely well researched, packed with facts and figures, packed with images, has 3 references to nighttime, and one in reality isn't a reference. So there are 2 references to the night in 98 pages of amazing science.
Amazing.
there's a problem there, right?
Amazing. Something else to add, Andrea or Alessio? The thing that gets me about this is we're talking about the initial reaction to what's going on. We're not talking about the secondary and tertiary effects of it. That I read a document about how one city is looking at allowing housing construction in their cities to begin happening at night. What are the neighbors going to think about that when there's a roofing company next door as they're trying to sleep? And we're right now in my state, in Texas, the fields are on fire. Okay, they're putting out the fire, but what about the cattle that have just gotten killed? And what does that do to the supply chain of beef into the food and restaurant system? It seems like we're spending so much time reacting to what's happening right now, we're not even able to think beyond. So in the process of making the economic argument, it seems like there's another point to be made to the elected officials and the policymakers and even business leaders that you don't understand. It's not about just right now. It's about what's coming, what's ahead. How do you convince people to think ahead, be proactive? Huh?
Maybe I can jump in here. I don't know if I can answer that specific question, but one thing I was thinking about when Michele was talking about the economic dynamic of all this is how we navigate the tensions between production and consumption. And I'll get into this now. And also speaking a little bit about the spatial element, the dynamics within this whole debate. So when we think about the city, when we think about the city at night, it's as I said before, it's not a monolithic experience, and life at night is more concentrated in specific areas. And what we saw historically is a separation of uses, of nighttime uses, of entertainment uses from other activities. That now is not the case anymore. And when we enter into all these debates about compact cities or the 15-minute city and the idea of proximity and how that's good for sustainability, what about the night? Where does that fit within this whole idea and notion of sustainability and the compact, walkable city? During COVID, we saw this idea of proximity becoming more real. As we saw, we had no alternative but to be outdoors. And we saw this rise of curbside seating, parklets, outdoor dining, and we became fans and tourists, local tourists in our own neighborhoods. However, one thing we need to think about is that the environmental footprint of our nighttime activity should not only be measured from the perspective of consumption, but also of production. COVID aside, now 2024, so we have to ask many questions. So where does the food offered in our local restaurant come from? Who takes care of our children if we want to go out? Where do these caregivers and the artists performing in the local pub live, and how much of their paycheck or how much fuel do they have to spend to get home after a gig? So what is the environmental footprint of the nighttime economy is something that we have to think about and consider in economic terms and in spatial terms. And also something else connected to something that Alessio was saying. We've been following for many years this trend of disappearance of many nighttime venues, and we've been talking a lot about the relevance from a cultural perspective and a heritage perspective of life at night. And there's places like Berlin where there's a Berghain, and there's clubs that have been institutionalized and they have a different status now. Years ago, nightlife was seen as something ephemeral, something temporary. But if nighttime and nightlife is becoming more permanent and more institutionalized, how can that have an impact on how we make these spaces more sustainable? So just throwing these questions over there as well.
So you're saying that, like, as many cities have opera houses and theater companies that are now institutions, Berlin has taken the lead in many instances of giving that same kind of weight to clubs and venues, saying this is now a cultural institution that deserves bigger support than just kind of the commercial support. Correct?
That's correct.
An answer. That's an answer. Alessio, do you have any kind of feedback on this particular thread?
I know I was thinking about the work of a really good organization based in Berlin that's called Clubtopia. And Clubtopia, I guess, consults other music venues, clubs, certainly in Europe, on how to make clubbing more sustainable. And they have a really great Green Club guide that is now finally also available in English, because I had to like a year or 2 years ago, I had to translate it with Google Translate. Before ChatGPT, I had to literally copy paste bits of that Green Club guide. But now it's finally available in English, and it's a 60-page guide that really is for anybody who wants to make their space, the venue, more sustainable. And they're like from the door to the bar and the DJ booth and anything around it. It's truly a great resource, for operators and night stakeholders. I also, I think I want to go back and make just one other point about on the costs, of inaction. What's the cost of not doing anything? Let's say we're not doing anything about it, and I think this will certainly we'll see increased event cancellations, and I think this will have major costs for the industry, because the rising frequency of extreme weather events will certainly lead to cancellations. So I'm increasingly curious to quantify a little bit both the how many of these events and venues are being impacted by it, but also the cost incurred by cities. And here again, I want to make a point about not just heat waves, but also flooding. And I think flooding is a topic that sometimes doesn't hit the headlines too much. But for instance, like Glasgow, a couple of years ago, had a terrible few weeks. A lot of clubs that were also in parts of the cities that, yes, a bit cheaper, a bit more rundown, but also more risk of being flooded. So these are the links that we need to make more visible.
I'm curious, Michele, about the report you mentioned that's 92 pages or 14,000 pages long that had 2 or 3 bullet points about the night. How has that mind changed? And what role does the nighttime community have with that? I mean, don't you sometimes feel like the nighttime community is the only people going, hey, we have a solution. One of those is to talk about this and to put it on the table. How has the opinion changed of people who are crafting documents like that to be more inclusive and mindful of the night?
Yeah, I think it's a good one, and that's a bias of mine that I live in the world of the UN system and the intricacies of 98-page documents. But the same thing can go with the latest versions of the IPCC report on climate change. Again, mention of the night is so scant in there that fundamentally we're not talking about. So talking about it is one key element. I guess talking about it beyond our specific talking to ourselves, but sort of really being on the front stage at these kind of events, of these kind of things, the World Urban Forum, the climate. There was a great set of things actually at the latest climate change conference in Dubai about it. So I think talking about it is critical. But I think one of the greatest things we were reflecting before the call, the three of us, and I guess that's part of the argument that the three of us are trying to make, is that the advancements that we've had in the last 5 years, 10 years maybe, on the nighttime economy debate allow to leapfrog entering the climate change space and climate change after dark space. Super practically. I'm thinking of work that Alessia has done with autonomy in London to shed light on the precariousness, the intersectionalities, the risk to workers at nighttime, and so the really precarious conditions they work in. Right, anyone that works in the nighttime economy would probably acknowledge that. But that allows to make that argument immediately into the questions of climate change after dark. Climate change after dark is very differently an industry like health, without dismissing the complications of being a nurse at nighttime. Health is much more tuned already to working at night than, say, part of the construction industry. Same thing with the question of the privatization of data. Who knows about the nighttime? Well, unfortunately, most of the information is still held by reasonably powerful, large multinational entities that have data, and that's typically based on spending and economic activity. So when you said to me climate change after dark, I sort of immediately went by bias to tropical and East Asian contexts, where most of the activity after dark is actually informal and not spending based, right? But we know it in the nighttime economy space. So in a sense, if we enter the climate change conversation conscious of what we already know from a nighttime economy angle, we just avoid re-having the same debates that we've been having for 10 years, that we have really solid evidence, that we say, well, let's pay attention to the informalities elements, let's pay attention to the diversity of jobs and the diversity of impacts. And maybe it allows us that flexibility to put ourselves into debates that might be uncomfortable, completely alien to us. Tangible example, one of the biggest impacts of climate change at night in cities that then has the direct impact on workers, but I don't think many of us in this kind of space have debated, is the zoonotic impact of climate change. Mosquitoes, insects, ticks, a variety of other animals that adapt their behaviors because the climate changes. We don't typically talk about mosquitoes in clubs, let's be honest. But the incidence on disease and sort of vulnerability of workers, imagine again being a waste worker for 4 a.m. or 5 a.m., picking up trash and having to deal with even more infestation of particular species. Well, that is probably one of the hottest debates, and has been one of the hottest debates because of the pandemic in the health sector, and the change of behavior of animals and how the interaction with that will lead to more pandemics. So in a sense, it's us being conscious that we have had great contribution, but it's also us putting ourselves in a very uncomfortable position, saying, yeah, you know what, I do want to talk about mosquitoes and health at nighttime, because that's a great intersection I have something to say about. So putting ourselves in the uncomfortable space.
Oh, yeah. Well, great. Yeah. But if anybody can do that, I'm convinced that the nighttime advocates can do that. We're used to being there. Like you said, we've been there for 10 years. It's an opportunity for the nighttime community to kind of rise up and go places where we not necessarily have talked about, exactly as you've discussed. Alessio, I want to talk a little bit more about nocturnal labor and the impact on that community, given what's happening. And not only that, we know that there are geopolitical issues right now with migration, and people are moving away from the hotter zones into the cities. They go to the cities. That's the case in the States. I'm assuming that's the case in Europe. And that causes all kinds of other kind of class tensions. And so it again, it's one of those tertiary results, and that the labor of the nighttime labor is oftentimes of the migrant labor, and that these might be their second or third job, and the burden on these folks and the inequalities. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? I suspect you can.
Sure. I also want to publicize, promote, because Michele has mentioned Autonomy, which is a research organization that works a lot on the future of work and has published, I wasn't involved, but I think it's an excellent report called Left Out in the Sun, that talks about statutory maximum working temperatures. This is something that Andreina has mentioned for Spain, but I think this again, if at some point we should get some of the people at ILO talking more seriously about this. So we should have minimum income, but also maximum working temperatures. Yeah, and I think cities can really do good advocacy job around that. But I think when it comes to nocturnal work, night work, and climate change and inequality, I think we have quite a lot of evidence, and I think more and more I see good newspaper articles, investigations into the lives of some of these workers The big known example that it's, for example, the construction workers from Texas all the way to Qatar when they were building the stadiums for the World Cup. And we know how the construction sector has very vulnerable, most of them migrant workers. And we hear some horror stories, for example, about their conditions in Gulf countries, also because these countries are rapidly, well, not rapidly urbanizing, but they're building big cities, and somebody has to build these cities. So all the way from Texas, where it's quite common practice to do construction work at night, also because materials don't react too well to high temperatures, and there are all sorts of and I was reading some years ago about exactly what you said, Randall, about people wanting to sleep at night, and at the same time companies having to adapt and shift some of their operations at night. So that is more and more attention, that we see there. More recently, just to shed some light onto some interesting, important case studies that should bring our attention to certain latitudes. Pakistan or India, delivery riders there. Again, we see now increasingly 2-3 month period with temperatures over 45, 50 degrees. We need to talk about nighttime in those cities, and what's happening there.
Andrea, and I see you taking all kinds of notes like you're ready to go at it. Give it to us. Come on.
I think what I'd like to add is maybe from the perspective of governance, and we've all worked a lot regarding this particular field. And one thing that is certain is that we've seen the growth and the rise of nighttime governance over the past decade, and that can certainly help perhaps raise these issues from a climate change perspective. So what can we bring from the nighttime governance field, not only government, but governance, into the climate change discussion? For instance, I'll mention a few examples. So one thing that has happened over the past several years is the rise of quality standards, accreditation schemes. I think about, I don't know, Purple Flag in Australia and the UK, but also Sello Seguro in Colombia, and how these schemes some of them include some considerations regarding the use of, or the ban of single-use plastic in establishments at night, and promoting certain conditions. Also, how the nighttime governance community has raised greater awareness of issues such as the ones that Alessio was mentioning before, with some labor considerations and the need to create better conditions for nighttime workers. And also, how can we, from the nighttime governance perspective, as I was mentioning before, how does this institutionalization and formalization of these debates around the nighttime, how can that help change the perception, or change from the mitigation perspective, in particular, change the environmental impact that this sector has. On one hand, quantify it. On the other hand, enact new policies, not only at the state level, but also at the city level, because one thing that's very important is to promote this dialogue between different levels of government that hasn't been happening. Most of these, and Michele, correct me if I'm wrong, but most of these conversations still happen at the state level. They need to come down to city level, and they need to incorporate new voices for cities really to see change in terms of mitigation and adaptation.
300%. Well, I've got a great question here, because you were talking about some policy changes just then. Asked from one of the people in the attending, what challenges have you observed regarding people's adaptation to nighttime regulations? Do people obey them when it comes to climate change? Anybody? We've talked about some positive examples of where things have happened well. Where's it not working out? Michele.
No, look, I can jump in to get us started, but I think let's start where Andreina finished, which is sort of if that is the question specifically on the climate change part of that story. Luckily, there is a very reasonably well-established movement of city-based action on climate change since the early 1990s, and the likes of it. So luckily, we have the city scale reaction to climate change. One of the problems is that lots of that type of regulation governance action has a daytime bias. So, for instance, we imagine action on climate change at a city level, but fundamentally during the nighttime, the city changes. It's kind of a different city, right? A context like Melbourne, a context like Barcelona, a context like London has 10% of the public transport available at night versus 100% at a day, right? So we're literally talking about a different city in many different contexts. So one of the key challenges there is that we can't quite solve or address climate change at night with the regulations and governance principles that we use at daytime, because we're looking at pretty different realities. And one of the biggest problems there, and potentially what is causing, I think the best answer to that question is Alessia's point before about what happens when I put more and more construction at night with harder and harder nights to sleep in. And you have frustrated people at one end and frustrated people doing even tougher shifts at the other end. So we have those clashes. The challenge there to me is that then structurally the stress comes at all levels, from the residents' ability to just simply exist and live at nighttime to the worker that gets even further displaced. So one of the biggest challenges to me there is that cities by far and large, and let alone countries, don't have the systems for dispute resolution and dispute management and prioritizing. But oftentimes that, I guess, last thing for me is we oftentimes forget, and this is work that, for instance, Arab was doing back at least 15 years, that there are multiple shades of the night, that the night isn't a thing. There are multiple different realities at night. My colleagues Anna Edwards and Jeff Pimenta were out overnight in Adelaide looking at nighttime workers on the street. The night meant 7 p.m. to 12 a.m. is not the same thing of 12 to 3. That is not the same thing of 4 to 5. So I think one of the biggest challenges there is that at times, maybe we're good at making the nighttime argument, but one risk with climate change is that we just do a monolithic single night argument rather than understanding the gradation of different types of nights and the challenges that might arise there. Do we need large construction work to happen at 3 a.m. in certain areas? Probably not.
Randall, you're on mute.
Yeah, it's probably best. Anyone else want to add to that particular topic? So I'm seeing a JC whose work I respect a great deal in terms of the migrant workforce, asks a couple of questions. So you can see them there. If one of you wants to tackle one of those, perhaps we've talked to a little bit. And then Angela also asks about the drought and how this is going to affect water in clubs. So there are several other questions here. Pick out one or two if you want to respond to them, and then we'll wrap up. Who wants to go first?
Like I just maybe go back to that first question, but make it slightly more general. Because, for example, when I think about, do people obey noise regulations in cities, for instance? Like maybe not everywhere, not all the time, and sometimes these are often like young people who get demonized, and we remember from the pandemic, on the one hand you have young people trying to assemble at night in a park and just chat, and this on the other end of the spectrum you have prime ministers who had parties, like in London. So what I'm saying is that I think that yes, you have situations where, for example, young people, yeah, may disobey certain regulations at night. But I think for me, what is important is to from a policy perspective, from a progressive public policy perspective, it's about how you make sure that those who want to sleep, those who have to work, and those who want to have fun at night can live together. And I think that is a difficult challenge, yeah, for anybody. But it's the problem I think we're trying to face here as
Well,
well.
I think also it comes back to nuance. I think we're used to black or white. I think it's hard. It's hard to think about all those things that we must take in consideration, that elected officials must take in consideration in order to kind of represent a group of people. Yeah, it's hard. Don't do the job if you don't think you're going to be able to do some hard work. Andreina, anything else that you want to add to this particular final wrap-up thread?
Yes, when I saw that question about the regulations that are challenging when adapting, I also thought about sound. And I've been a witness of how sound meters are placed in many cities around the world. And then the data that generated from those sound meters is published. And then all kinds of things happen, from residents using the data to complain, but also at the same time, some businesses seeing some losses. Or in the end, I think it's about it goes back to the governance aspect. It's understanding that we need clear policies, we need clear strategies. And going to the other question of if I estimate from JC, if I estimate to what extent nighttime activities are more a cause or a consequence, it's a chicken and egg situation. I think it's important to tackle both. To, on one hand, really focus on the mitigation strategies. And here in Paris, for instance, there's several clubs that have joined initiatives to ban single-use plastic, or there's an open call every year to provide financial support to music venues to invest in security and accessibility and noise reduction. And the winners of these calls gain resources to soundproof their venues, to make them more sustainable. But also from the adaptation perspective, thinking about looking at the hours of operation of some of our services, and also what times the parks close. Can we open them a bit later to adapt to the temperatures? So it's doing both hand in hand, I think, as part of a strategy in which we take into account different interests, and we really look at this from a governance perspective that involves different levels and different voices. I think that's my take on this.
A final word from you, Alessio, on the whole topic. Anything you felt like was left out that needs to be brought up?
You need to give me 30 seconds, but I will fill in these 30 seconds by saying hi to JC and to say how much his work has been important for
extraordinary
for a lot of people doing research at night and night work, and the book on in the invisible migrant night workers in London, who, by the way, distribute, circulate food for a huge megalopoly like London. I think I think has really inspired a lot of these different conversations. I guess maybe one last point, looking at Angela's question, yeah, about again this sort of I guess, I've also questioned myself. I have this anxiety around climate change and, what everybody should or shouldn't do, and this idea that, if there is water scarcity, should we run a club night? Yeah, should we have fun? And I think for me, the answer to this a bit existential question is perhaps the very last thing that I would do on a planet that is impacted by climate change would probably, listen to some music with friends. I think we shouldn't we shouldn't stop, yeah, cherishing night culture.
I agree. And I think there's power in the night culture in ways that we haven't even begun to kind of manifest. So, Michele. any final word here? That the idea of doing this grouping was yours. I'm very appreciative of it. Thank you so much. And before you move away from the sharks and the giant spiders, is there a final word you want to add on this topic with this group?
Well, we've got good stuff. The idea was really Alessio, and I just pointed out that Alessio was bringing the three of us together. But the kudos to that. No, and just again, a big kudos to JC's work, because the immediate thing that comes to mind to me when you say climate change at night is JC's description of working with fingerless gloves in freezing cold London, and that was my point. I think the main thing that I would recommend from one of the southernmost cities in the world is that there is, in a sense, what Andreina said all along before any one of us, which was there's an uncomfortable admission that needs to happen, especially in call it Western, call it Euro-American, call it whatever you want, for sort of northern contexts, that southern and eastern contexts are much better at this than we are. We need to imagine ourselves, we sit in the city of Melbourne, in the city of Sydney, we need to imagine ourselves on what has Jakarta, what has Karachi, what has most of tropical context and Eastern context done, because they have a much longer experience of that. They have a much better ingrained imagination of what can you do at nighttime, simply because they had more time to work through that. So I think my plug there is we need a much better cosmopolitan imagination, and we need to be much more open to learning from South America or tropical Southeast Asia, and see what kind of models and ideas that emerge from there can be imported into a London or into a Melbourne, rather than being stuck up and being in the north, I guess. So a big plug for that.
Okay, that sounds perfect. And the failure is not an option here. And I totally look forward to more coming out of this. As you mentioned, this is a leap, I think, into a whole realm of discussion that I hope to see more research and hope to see more action in, because we must not fail. And with that, and my appreciation, we will close this program. Michele, Andreina, Alessio, thank you so much. Nice to meet you. Andrea and I have met before, but gentlemen, nice to meet you for the first time. I've admired all three of your work for some time and will continue to do so, I'm sure. And to the audience, thank you for joining us. Our next free webinar will be in April. It's going to be titled In the Headlights, another gloomy topic. It's going to be exploring what can be done about the dramatic rise in fatalities for those who walk, bike, and roll in cities at night, particularly in the States. It's startling what's going on there, and why have people come out at night if we're just going to hit them with a 3-ton vehicle? Visit 24hournation.com to listen to our Nighttime Economy podcast or to watch previous webinars. Join our Nighttime Economy group on LinkedIn, where we're kind of having all kinds of conversations and following what's happening around the world, and follow 24-Hour Nation on social media to learn more about the people, programs, and possibilities in our cities at night. My name is Randall White. Thank you all again.
Thank you.